Welcome back to All About Winning Daily Fantasy Sports. My name is Ty Patton. In this video, I will identify the top wide receivers to target in Week 11 for your DFS main slate lineups. As I always do, I like to take a quick look back at the results for the wide receiver position from the previous week. In Week 10, these were the top 5 projected wide receivers. Evans from Tampa Bay, Thomas from New Orleans, Tyreek Hill from Kansas City, Julio Jones from Atlanta, and Cooper Kupp from the Rams. The actual top 5 scoring were as follows. Kirk from Arizona, who scored 40.8 fantasy points. Slayton from the Giants, who scored 37.1 fantasy points. Tyreek Hill, who scored 36 fantasy points. Mike Thomas from New Orleans, who scored 31.2 fantasy points. And Cleveland's Landry, who scored 24.7 fantasy points. Also like to mention the ownership, and these were the top 5 wide receivers as far as ownership. Leading the way was Michael Thomas, and he had a 33.55% ownership, which was really high. Evans was 16.36% ownership. Kirk had 14.35% ownership. Pascal from the Colts had 13.90% ownership. And Golden Tate from the Giants had 11.65% ownership. These top 5 wide receivers averaged 33.96 fantasy points. They averaged 12.80 targets, which breaks down to 2.65 fantasy points per target. 4 of the top 5 scoring wide receiver teams actually lost their games straight up. With the wide receiver position, I use the following categories to identify the best to target. Obviously, I'm looking at game totals. I'm also looking at targets, matchups, average depth of target, fantasy points scored per game, red zone targets, how much their opponents give up to the that position, and points per snap. And another thing that I wanted to mention about the 4 of the top 5 scoring wide receivers were on teams that lost their games. That tells you a little bit about the actual game script. Obviously, if you're behind, you're going to be throwing the ball more, which was the case in these situations. Obviously, their teams were behind, and they were having to try to catch up by moving the ball through the air. I've developed this chart that you'll see here. And the main reason I did this is because I used to provide just a lot of numbers, and I know it was really difficult for people to follow along and correlate it and put things together. So I developed this chart. I encourage you to screenshot it or pause the video, use it however you may like. It addresses some of the main categories that I use when I'm trying to identify wide receivers to target and for my DFS lineups. I'll go over this real quick with you. The colors, red is obviously the worst, yellow is kind of middle of the road, and green is the best. Now this is in comparison, like red in comparison to the green. Obviously Michael Thomas isn't a bad wide receiver. It's just that salary, $9,900 in comparison to $4,100 is obviously a lot worse. You're going to be really paying up to get to Michael Thomas this week. But some of the other categories, as I mentioned earlier, targets per game, fantasy points per game scored, how many their fantasy points per game their opponent gives up to that position, the opponent's DVP versus that position, their opponent this week, how many red zone targets they've had, their average depth of target. And that's targets. That's not receptions. Like whether it's the ball is caught or not, how deep are their routes? This is points per snap. This actual fantasy points with all things relevant. And last category is over under. So with that being said, these are the wide receivers that I'm going to target in week 11, and I'm going to give you the reason why, and I encourage you to follow along with this chart. Excuse me. Michael Thomas, 9,900. I can honestly tell you, I don't know that I've ever seen a wide receiver who had a salary that high. When you think about that, and then you think about Christian McCaffrey at 10,500. I mean, it takes a lot to pay off that 9,900. Now, that could be contrarian because Michael Thomas can do that, and New Orleans is coming in off of a loss. This is a really good matchup for them against Tampa Bay. I think Tampa Bay is going to be able to put some points on them as well. So the game flow definitely favors a passing game, high scoring. Over under is 50 points. And you look here, Michael Thomas, he's getting 11.4 targets per game. That's his average. He's scoring 25.2 fantasy points per game, which is the highest on the slate. The opponent, Tampa Bay, gives up 50.7 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, and their DVP, obviously, if they're giving up 50.7 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver, they're dead last in number 32 versus wide receiver. He's received 13 red zone targets. His average depth of target isn't that good. It's only 7.7 yards, but his actual fantasy points per snap is really good, 0.392. One of the second highest on this slate. And as I mentioned, the over-under is 50 points. It's just going to be really hard to get up to him. Have a lot of interest in stacking that game, but stacking him with Breeze and balancing out your lineup is going to be the trick. I can tell you right now, I've seen some early ownership numbers, and he was coming in as the highest owned wide receiver, even at 9,900. He was coming in right now at 25.64% with the site that I use. But we'll address that when we do the lineup building video. Next up, Amari Cooper, 7,700, $2,200 cheaper than Thomas. Obviously, Cooper can definitely break a slate. Waiting kind of on the news about Matt Stafford, and that's going to affect how I want to build either with Dallas's running game or their passing game. If Stafford's there, I'm probably going to lean towards the passing game a little bit more because I believe Detroit will be able to put a few points on the board against Dallas. The thing that really worries me is if this becomes a Zeke game. Zeke hasn't had that really big ceiling game, and if he does, and there's no need for them to throw the ball, then they'll go that way. And Zeke's been getting a lot of touches, and history shows when he gets 25 or more touches, the Cowboys, I believe they've only lost one game. I thought I've seen something they were like 25-1 when he touches the ball 25 times or more. So obviously they would like to go that route. And as I mentioned in my previous video, Detroit's number 32 versus the run. So, and they give up a lot of fantasy points per game to the running back positions. So that's what worries me about Amari Cooper. It's a nice price, but is it really? The reason it looks nice is because it's $2,200 off of Michael Thomas. For him to pay that off, you're looking at 30 points. For value on that. He's getting 7.9 targets per game. He's averaging 21.3 fantasy points per game. Detroit's only giving up 37.4 fantasy points per game. Say only, it's kind of middle of the road. And they have a DVP of 19 versus the wide receiver position. He would probably be matched up against Slay in this game. Slay hasn't been shut down this year, but it's a more difficult matchup. He's had 6 red zone targets, which really isn't that high. His average depth of target is pretty good at 13.1 yards on average depth of target, and his points per snap is the best on this slate at 0.40. Game totals 47 points. What I'm really interested in is seeing what's going on with Matt Stafford, and I haven't seen any updates to that. And right now, Amari Cooper is coming in at pretty fairly under-owned. So I would probably have a lot of interest in him if he was going to have really low ownership. He's way down the list. Oh, here he is. I'm sorry. Coming in at 8.92% compared to 25.64% for Michael Thomas. So he's about 10th. But depending on what happens with Stafford, it will depend on whether or not how much Amari Cooper I have. As I said, that's a nice pivot off of Michael Thomas, but that's only because Michael Thomas has got such an outrageous salary. The 7,700 is not really that appealing when you think about what you need for value. Next up is Julian Edelman. He's 7,600. He's getting 10 targets per game. He's scoring 18 fantasy points per game. Philly's given up 41.5 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, and which is the number 25 DVP versus the wide receiver. He's had 17 red zone targets, which is the most on this slate. He has an average depth of target of 8.6 yards, which isn't that high. And I mean, if you followed or seen any New England games, you know he is pretty much like their running game. They like to throw it to him quick and get him the ball and try to get it to him into some open space. He's averaging .277 fantasy points per snap. The over-under is not that appealing at 44.5 points, but they're coming off a loss and coming off a bye, and I really think Brady's going to put the ball in the air against Philadelphia. Philadelphia is pretty stingy versus the run, and I can see Edelman getting peppered with a lot of targets in this game, double-digit targets. He's averaging double digits anyhow, but I don't think 15 targets is out of reach. And you mix that in with 100 yards and a touchdown, you got a really high score. And I actually like Edelman more than Cooper, which is just $100 ahead of him. Next up, Mike Evans. Now, Mike Evans is, I have him yellow, and I just seen the news where Lattimore is out, so I'm probably going to change Mike Evans to green right along with Chris Godwin. He's 7,400. He's getting 9.9 targets per game. He's scoring an average of 22.2 fantasy points per game. New Orleans is giving up 37.6 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, and they have a DVP of 21 versus wide receiver. He's had 14 red zone targets, has the second highest ADOT on the slate at 15.6 yards per target. He's averaging .331 points per snap, and over-under is the highest on the slate at 50.5 points. Second highest, I'm sorry, to the Houston game. I have a lot of interest in the Tampa Bay passing game versus New Orleans. New Orleans is, and I just noticed, I don't know how this is 50 up here and 50.5 down here. It's supposed to be 50.5, I'm sorry, for Thomas. But I like Evans a lot. I really like it now that Lattimore's out, because he didn't in the past. Lattimore's had some luck in shutting Evans down. So I had a lot of interest in Godwin this week. Now it makes it a little bit more difficult. I'm probably going to look at the ownership numbers to decide which one. I like the idea of stacking this game. It's just going to be hard to get the stack pieces from New Orleans with how high their players are. But I will have some pieces of this. This definitely has the potential to just be fantasy points paradise in this game. And I really like the fact New Orleans coming off a loss in Tampa Bay. And both teams are pretty good against the run, so they're going to have to put it in the air. And I see some points. This scoreboard's going to get lit up in this game. After Mike Evans is Chris Godwin. He's $100 less than Evans, $7,300. He's getting 9.2 targets per game, averages 21.6 fantasy points per game. So both those categories is just slightly under what Evans is averaging. New Orleans gives up 37.6 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver with a DVP of 21 overall. He's had 9 red zone targets in comparison to 14 for Mike Evans. Mike Evans is a bigger target, obviously. Winston likes to go to Evans, especially when they get down close. His ADOT is 5 yards less than Mike Evans. He has a 10.5 ADOT, so his routes are shorter than Evans. His .304 fantasy points per snap, and as I mentioned, the game total is 50.5 points. When I first looked at this, I was all over Godwin because I knew Evans was going to be matched up with Lattimore, but now the news that Lattimore is out, I can see both of these guys getting targeted. I don't know who's going to be on who now, but I'll have some interest in both these guys, and it's not beyond possibility of actually running them both together with Winston. And I will try to stack this game. I really like it a lot. I'm attracted to the games that have the higher totals, and especially wide receivers in those games. Next up, DJ Moore. He's $5,900, which is a really nice savings. He's going to have some pretty high ownership. And by the way, before going further, Chris Godwin is actually third in projected ownership behind Michael Thomas and Cortland Sutton this week so far. And that's the early projected numbers from the site that I use. So if he's higher owned than Evans, I'll probably go to Evans. So back to DJ Moore. He's 5,900, which is probably going to cause his ownership to go way up. He's getting a lot of targets the last few weeks with Kyle Allen. He's averaging 8.8 targets per game. Atlanta's giving up 42 points per game to the wide receiver position. They have a DVP of 26 versus the wide receiver. He's received 6 red zone targets, mainly because McCaffrey's on this team, and he gets half of everything. His ADOT is 10.4 yards. His points per snap is 0.238. This over-under is set at 50.5 points. I think there's going to be a lot of points in this game. I definitely think that Carolina is going to be able to move the ball more easily through the air, but they'll get McCaffrey coming out of the backfield and pepper him with targets as well. But Allen really likes to go to Moore, and he's received a ton of targets the last few weeks. Really like his price at 5,900, but I'm going to watch ownership because I feel like he's going to have a lot higher ownership as we get closer to Sunday at that price, as people try to fit in other pieces of some of these games, like the New Orleans and the Houston games, trying to fit some of those pieces in there will cause you to drop down and get receivers like this. But if his ownership is lower than what I expect, I'll definitely have some interest in him. And sometimes he could be a pivot off of McCaffrey, as dangerous as that sounds. But we'll see when we do some lineup building. We'll address this again. But I definitely have him in the player pool. Next up is Marquise Brown. And Marquise Brown is $5,600. He is getting 6.7 targets per game. He's averaging 14.3 fantasy points per game. Houston's giving up 42.8 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, and they have a DVP of 28 versus the wide receiver. He's only received 6 red zone targets. He has an ADOT of 12.4. He's averaging 0.36 fantasy points per snap, which is the third highest on this slate. And this game has a game total of 49.5 points. So fairly high total. And I have a lot of interest in Brown. Now, Jackson's one quarterback that I'm comfortable running without any targets. Usually my quarterback, I always want one target at least when I'm building my lineups. Jackson's one quarterback that I can use without any targets. But I do like to have Marquise Brown, and I think that he has the capability of getting behind this Houston defense and torching them for a couple long touchdowns. And a couple long touchdowns, it doesn't take much to get value at 5,600. So I have a lot of interest with him, pairing him up with Lamar Jackson. Like I said, it's not, for me, it's not a necessity to pair Jackson with anybody. But if I use Brown, I probably don't want to use him without Lamar Jackson. Just my preference. Next up, Tyler Boyd. He's 5,200. He's receiving 10 targets per game. Oakland's giving up 42.3 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. They have a DVP of 27 versus the wide receiver. He's only received 4 red zone targets, has an ADOT of 7.3 yards, really low points per snap, 0.224, um, third highest total on the board at 48.5 points. I think Tyler Boyd's real sneaky this week. Oakland's weak versus the pass, and Cincinnati has a new quarterback in Ryan Finley, and he didn't get off to a great start last week. But one thing about him in college is he was a very accurate quarterback. He had some nice throws last week. Um, got tagged for an interception for touchdown, pick six, and a fumble for a touchdown, and all those things that happen to rookie quarterbacks when they're being erratic. But I just have a feeling that Cincinnati, I don't know if they'll win. I just feel that they're going to be competitive, and one surefire way of being competitive is to get the ball to Mixon and Boyd, and I could see Finley targeting Boyd a lot, and him being sneaky. And at 5,200, it doesn't take much to get value at that. And I just feel that Cincinnati is going to be able to put some points on the board. Their game total, they only have an implied total of 19 points because they're like a double-digit underdog. But underdogs on the road, those are the wide receivers that I'm interested in, as well as the big home favorites. But they should be in comeback mode according to the point spread, and that means you're going to be peppering your wide receivers with targets. I have him in yellow because I'm kind of on the fence about him, but the more I think about it, I'm probably actually going to have Boyd go green and put him in the player pool when I go and use the optimizer and build some lineups that way. Next up, Mohamed Sanu, 5,100. He's averaging 6.8 targets per game. He's only scoring 11 fantasy points per game. Philadelphia gives up 41.5 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. They're number 25 versus the wide receiver. That's how you move the ball against Philadelphia, is through the air. Now, they've gotten a little bit better in their pass defense in the last few weeks. New England coming off of a loss on the road, small road favorite. And knowing that Philly is so stingy against the run, I look for Brady to be putting the ball in the air a lot. The last game for Sanu, he got double-digit targets from Brady. I don't know if that's the case this week. Brady likes to go to Edelman a lot, but he does like to spread the ball around. 5,100 doesn't take much to get value for that. Would definitely need Philadelphia to do a little bit of scoring in this game to give the right game script for Sanu, but we'll consider him. He might be a nice pivot off of Edelman or someone to plug in so you can spend up and get to some other higher salary players. Next is Alden Tate. He's 4,200. He's getting 7.5 targets per game. He's averaging 9.7 fantasy points per game. Oakland's giving up 42.3 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. They're number 27 DVP versus the wide receiver. He's had 14 red zone targets, which is tied for second most on this slate. Now, a lot of that was under Andy Dalton. He's getting has a 10.4 average depth of target. He's only scoring 0.16 fantasy points per snap. Third highest total game on the board, 48.5 points. I do feel that, as I mentioned, Cincinnati is going to be able to be competitive in this game. I probably won't have many shares of Tate. I got him in yellow, kind of on the fence with him. Dalton was targeting Tate a lot when he was in, but last week, Finley in his first game, Tate's a big target too. But in the last game against Baltimore, Finley's first touchdown pass came on a pass to Eifert, which is not uncommon for a rookie quarterback to lean on their to check down to their running backs or look for their tight ends. So He's probably going to have some regression on those red zone targets, but he's a wide receiver that you can consider in this type of matchup with Oakland being number 27 versus the wide receiver. And last and certainly not least, Ted Ginn Jr., 4,100. He's getting 3.9 targets per game. Actually, gets more targets per game when Drew Brees is in there. Didn't get targeted as much when Bridgewater was in. He's scoring 7.6 fantasy points per game. Tampa Bay is giving up the worst on this slate, 50.7 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Ranked dead last in DVP versus wide receiver at number 32. He's only had 3 red zone targets. His average depth of target is pretty high at 14.8 yards. He's scoring 0.162 fantasy points per snap, and the second highest total on this board. I have a lot of interest in Ginn. I have a lot of interest in the New Orleans passing game, Tampa Bay passing game, all kinds of pieces. And he's one way that you can get exposure to that game at fairly low salary, 4,100. It doesn't take much to get value. And I believe this game is going to shoot out. And I'm going to have all kinds of pieces, and it's just about being creative and how you put it together to differentiate yourself, whether you're in a large GPP or cash game. These are the type of players that you can plug in so that you can spend up in other areas. So I obviously want to target the. I obviously want to have a target to go with my quarterbacks, as I mentioned. Other than Lamar Jackson, I don't feel like I have to. I still like to pair him up with like Hollywood Brown or his tight ends, Andrews. That was a nice combination last week. But for me, I usually want to, if I'm going to use wide receiver, I'm going to, or my quarterback, I'm at least going to have one of his targets with him. I look for wide receivers in the higher total games, as I mentioned, within the games that have the higher implied totals for their teams. And that's just my starting point. And I wanted to mention this again last week. Someone reached out to me and said it kind of didn't make sense that I was using players from the Chicago game. It was the lowest total on the board, blah, blah, blah. And I don't do MME 150 lineups. I would if I could. It makes sense. Hey, kudos to the guys that can do it. If I ever get the chance, I will do it. But I build some different lineups and put them in different contests. And I use the player pool that I have, but I mix it up. And I thought Trubisky and Robinson would be contrarian last week versus Detroit. And I also had some interest in Montgomery, which that backfired. He had real high ownership as well. And, Detroit's worst against the run. I thought it set up really nice for him. And I just had some interest. I thought it'd be contrarian to go to the Bears. It's kind of trying to differentiate myself in the larger GPP tournament. And someone mentioned that. Just because I target the games that have the higher totals, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to look at the other games and see if there's pieces there or matchups there that can be exploited for value. So I just wanted to let you know that I don't just look at the games over here in green, and I don't look at any of the yellow or red. That's not true. But that's just a starting point for me. So a review of the wide receivers I am targeting in week 11 is as follows. Michael Thomas, Amari Cooper, Julian Edelman, Mike Evans. I got Evans in yellow. I'll be switching him to green with the information that Lattimore's out. Chris Godwin, DJ Moore, Marquise Brown, Tyler Boyd, Mohamed Sanu, Alden Tate, and Ted Ginn Jr. I want to thank you guys for joining me. I really appreciate you following my videos. My subscriptions have been trending upwards, and that's a good thing, as well as my viewers. Created these charts for you guys to hopefully help you follow along and use it how you might want to use it yourself. Feel free to drop any comments or opinions below. Let me know if there's something you'd like to see me add, something you don't like. If I can make that change, I'll see what I can do for you. But please feel free to drop any comments. And the person that asked me about, I just want a little disclosure here. The person that asked me about why would I use a player from the Chicago game, it didn't make any sense. It was low total. I wasn't upset about that because this is my channel and this is how I do it, you know. And however you build your lineups, that's fine. I'm just trying to provide you some extra information, and I hope you get some value out of it. It really helps me out if you guys share this video, like it, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you get notified when my next video posts. And I'll be posting the tight end defense special teams video shortly, and following that up with some lineup building, so where we can put all this stuff together, doing some optimized lineups, a game by game recap, and getting ready for tomorrow and putting together some winning lineups. Again, I appreciate you for joining me. You can also follow me on Twitter at winningabout. My name is Ty Patton. This is all about winning daily fantasy sports, and I'll see you again real soon.